Backstage smelled of sweat and velvet money when the 350-pound wall stepped into Bumpy Johnson's path, calling him Harlem trash. Hands tightened, knuckles weighted. Everyone expected blood because Bumpy didn't raise his voice. Backstage carried a different kind of heat, not the honest heat of a summer street, where kids ran and men argued and everybody knew who belonged. This heat was trapped under velvet curtains and stage lights, pressed into the air by expensive perfume and nervous sweat. It smelled like money that didn't work for anybody. It smelled like men smiling too hard. Bumpy Johnson walked through it like he owned nothing and feared nothing. His suit was dark, clean, precise, no shine, no flash. The kind of cloth that didn't beg for attention. He moved with his hands low, his shoulders loose, his face calm in a way that made other men feel loud just for breathing. 2 doors behind him. The music on stage rose, then fell. Applause rolled through the walls like distant thunder. The crowd was happy out there buying his story. Back here, stories got corrected. A runner in a wrinkled shirt looked up, saw Bumpy, and swallowed. The boy's eyes did what his mouth wouldn't. They asked, "Who let you in?" Bumpy didn't answer questions that weren't spoken. He continued forward, steady as a man walking to church. His gaze traveled without hurry, props stacked like forgotten bodies. A laugh followed, sharp and paid for. Somewhere, a bottle clinked against glass. Someone important was enjoying himself. Bumpy turned a corner, and the hallway tightened. A man filled it. He wasn't just big. He was built like a door that had learned to breathe. 350 pounds, give or take, and every pound placed with purpose. His shoulders were wide enough to stop traffic. His hands looked like they'd been carved from old wood. His suit strained at the seams like it hated him for existing. He stood with his feet planted apart, not guarding a hallway claiming it. 2 smaller men were near him, hanging back like shadows that knew their place. The big man's eyes found Bumpy and did not blink. His mouth curled, not quite a smile. The kind of expression you wore when you thought the world was supposed to step aside. He lifted his chin. Slow. "Where you headed, boy?" The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of assumption. It was an insult dressed like a question. Bumpy stopped close enough to be heard, far enough to be safe. He looked at the man's tie, then his collar, then his eyes. He took his time like time belonged to him. "I'm headed through," Bumpy said. His voice wasn't soft. It wasn't hard. It was final. The big man's nostrils flared. His eyes flicked down Bumpy's suit, measuring him the way butchers measure. "Meat? Through where?" the man asked. "This ain't Harlem? You lost?" One of the smaller men behind him chuckled, quick, like he needed to show loyalty. Bumpy's expression didn't change. A calm face is a mirror. It forces the other man to stare at himself. "I'm not lost," Bumpy said. "And I don't borrow directions from strangers." That line landed without sound, but it moved the air. The big man took 1 step forward. The hallway got smaller. He said, clear enough for the shadows to hear, "Backstage is for performers and their people. You ain't either." Trash. The word hit like a slap meant for an audience. A stagehand passing with a crate paused and froze, eyes wide. Another man in a clipboard suit appeared at the far end of the corridor, then stopped like he'd walked into a church fight. Even the curtains seemed to hold their breath. Bumpy looked past the big man toward a door marked with a gold plaque. He could hear voices behind it, men laughing, a heavier voice in the middle of them, relaxed and entertained. A famous man's voice. He reacted to the intention. This wasn't about him being in the wrong hallway. This was about a message. A test delivered. In public. A line drawn in front of witnesses. The big man was waiting for Bumpy to do what people expected a man with pride to do: flare up, curse, swing first. Give them a reason to paint him as the animal they wanted him to be. Bumpy didn't move. He let silence do the work. When he finally spoke, it was calm enough to cut. "Step aside," Bumpy said. The big man laughed once loud. He turned his head, slightly as if checking for approval from someone behind the door. The laughter wasn't for Bumpy. It was for the invisible boss who owned the hallway. He leaned closer. "Or what?" Bumpy's eyes stayed steady. He looked at the man's hands. Big hands, heavy hands. Hands that had broken ribs and held guns and shoved men into corners. Hands that expected fear. Bumpy lifted his own hands, not as fists, but as proof open, relaxed. It was almost polite. "Or you'll make a mistake," Bumpy said. The big man's smile faded. He didn't like that. He didn't like being spoken to like he was the one who could lose. "You threatening me?" The big man growled. Bumpy's gaze rose to the man's face, still unshaken. "No," Bumpy said. "I'm warning you." A whisper of movement behind the big man. The smaller men shifted their feet. They could feel the difference between a hothead and a man who had decided. From behind the gold-plaqued door, the heavier voice laughed again, followed by others' comfortable laughter. Someone had no idea a storm was forming 10 feet away. Or worse, someone knew and wanted to watch. The big man rolled his shoulders like he was loosening a chain. He took another step, close enough that his shadow covered Bumpy's shoes. He spoke low now, intimate, like a private humiliation. "I heard about you," he said. "Little king of a little neighborhood. Out here, you just another." He didn't finish because Bumpy took one step forward not into the man's chest, not into his space like a drunk, looking for trouble, into the line. The line you don't cross unless you mean it. Their faces were close. The big man could smell Bumpy's cologne clean, restrained. He could see Bumpy's eyes still. No rage, no fear, just judgment. Bumpy's voice dropped so only the big man could hear it. "You're standing in a hallway," he said, thinking. "Your size is law, but law is what happens after." The big man's jaw tightened. His pride wanted violence. His body was built for it. His whole job was violence. Bumpy did not flinch. He did not blink. He did not give him the gift of panic. Stage light somewhere buzzed faintly. The hallway seemed to wait. And then the big man made his choice. His shoulder twitched. His hands started to rise slow at first, then faster. The way men move when they decide they won't be disrespected. Everyone watching braced for impact, because they expected a fight. They expected chaos. They expected Bumpy Johnson to finally show teeth. Bumpy's face stayed calm, like the verdict had already been written. Harlem didn't need a throne. It had stoops and barbershops and church steps worn down by Sunday shoes. It had corners where men leaned like they were holding the whole block in place. It had music spilling out of windows and arguments that ended with laughter because nobody could afford to stay mad too long. Harlem was a living courtroom. Every face was a witness. Every rumor was testimony. And every action, every small action, went into the record. Bumpy Johnson understood that record the way a preacher understands scripture. He didn't rule Harlem with shouting. He ruled it with balance, with the kind of control that made violence feel like a last resort, not a hobby. He could walk into a room and lower the temperature without saying a word. That was power. Not the kind that broke things, the kind that kept things from breaking. On Lenox Avenue, a boy ran with a paper under his arm, laughing like he owned the morning. A woman leaned from a window, calling after him, not angry, protective. 2 old men sat outside a storefront, playing cards with hands that shook just enough to show time had won some battles, but not all. Bumpy moved through that world steady as a lawman, and Harlem moved around him like it recognized its own spine. Man in a cap tipped his head when Bumpy passed. Not a bow. A signal. I see you. A shopkeeper stepped out and placed a hand on a kid's shoulder, guiding him away from the street as Bumpy approached. Not fear, respect. Like you move children away from a passing car, not because the car was evil, but because the car was heavy and the consequences were real. Bumpy didn't smile much. Smiles were currency in Harlem, and he didn't spend them carelessly. When he nodded back, it was enough. His driver waited at the curb in a dark sedan that didn't brag. The car was clean, but not loud. Like Bumpy, everything useful, nothing theatrical. He got in and closed the door softly. Inside, the city noise muted. The world became leather, glass, and quiet. His driver glanced at him once in the mirror, then looked away like a man who knew when not to ask questions. Bumpy didn't speak right away. He watched the street slide by. He watched Harlem breathe. He saw a group of young men near a corner, restless. Their shoulders held a new hunger: fast money, fast respect, fast danger. One of them looked toward the sedan and stiffened. Another tugged his sleeve, whispering something. They straightened as the car passed, like they'd been reminded there were rules older than their impatience. Bumpy didn't approve of reckless youth, but he didn't despise it either. You didn't despise a fire. You contained it. You taught it what to burn and what to leave alone. The driver cleared his throat like he was stepping onto thin ice. "Mr. Johnson," he said carefully, "you want me to take the long way today?" Bumpy looked forward. His face stayed calm, but his mind was on single quotes stage. The insult, the weight of that bodyguard's presence, and the heavier presence behind the gold-plaqued doorman laughing like the world was theirs to design. "No," Bumpy said. "We take the usual way." The driver nodded. The car rolled on. Bumpy's left hand rested on his knee. The hand was still. His ring caught a sliver of light and returned it without apology. That ring wasn't a decoration. It was a statement. "I have been here long enough to be known." The sedan passed the church where Bumpy had once stood outside after a funeral, listening to mothers cry and men pretend they weren't crying. He remembered the weight of that day. Not the coffin, but what it meant when a young man died for nothing. When pride became a bullet. When a neighborhood paid the bill. Bumpy had made himself a promise, then one he never said aloud because promises spoken too easily are broken too quickly. Harlem would not be treated like disposable land. Harlem would not be hunted for sport. If money had to move through Harlem, it would move with permission. If violence came to Harlem, it would come with consequences. That was his code. Not written in ink, written in outcomes. They stopped near a small storefront, where the window displayed suits and hats like quiet soldiers. A man stood outside, sweeping the sidewalk with slow, steady strokes. He looked up and nodded as the sedan slowed. His eyes didn't ask for charity. They asked for stability. Bumpy stepped out. The winter air cut sharp, but he didn't react. Cold was honest. Cold didn't smile at you and then steal your coat. He walked into the shop, warmth wrapped around him, fabric, steam, the faint scent of starch. The tailor looked up from behind a counter, a thin man with careful hands and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Johnson," the tailor said softly. Bumpy nodded. Morning. There was a pause. Harlem pauses were full of information. Taylor didn't ask why Bumpy was here, but his eyes did. His eyes said, "Something's in the air." Bumpy lifted a hand slightly, not ordering, not requesting, inviting. "Close the door," he said. The tailor closed it. The street noise softened again, and now the shop became a private room inside a loud world. Bumpy turned his head a fraction, watching the tailor's reflection in a mirror. Mirrors were useful. They showed you what approached without forcing you to turn your back. "You hear talk?" Bumpy asked. The tailor's fingers tightened on the edge of the counter, then relaxed. I hear talk, the tailor admitted. Bumpy waited. They say, you were at a theater, the tailor continued carefully. They say a man stood in your way. Bumpy's face didn't change. They say a lot, the tailor swallowed. They say you were disrespected. That word disrespected was a match in Harlem. It could light a whole street if dropped carelessly. Bumpy leaned slightly toward the counter. Not threatening present. Let them talk, Bumpy said. A man's mouth is the cheapest weapon he owns. The tailor nodded, relieved to hear. Calm, but still worried because calm from Bumpy wasn't softness. Calm was preparation. Outside, a car horn sounded. Somewhere down the block, a vendor called out, selling oranges like the world had no shadows. Bumpy's eyes stayed on the mirror. Tell me something, Bumpy said. Yes, sir. Who benefits from that talk? The tailor hesitated. Then, like a man choosing honesty over safety, he said it. Men who want your name to look small. Bumpy's gaze narrowed, not with anger focus. Exactly, he said. He straightened his coat with a single smooth motion. Then we won't make it loud, Bumpy said. We'll make it certain. The tailor's throat moved. Certain how? Bumpy turned toward the door. He placed his hand on the knob, and for a moment he paused, listening to the street, his street, like a father listens to his house at night. Then he spoke without turning back. By reminding them, he said, Harlem doesn't beg for respect. He opened the door. Cold air rushed in, and with it came the quiet truth that every man in Harlem understood, even if they couldn't say it neatly. When Bumpy Johnson decided something, the decision didn't wobble. It didn't scream. It simply arrived. That night, Harlem wore its lights like jewelry. Neon in the windows. Street lamps painting the sidewalks gold. Music rolling out of basements and second-floor bars, sweet and bitter at the same time. The air tasted like roasted nuts, cigarette smoke, and winter breath. Bumpy Johnson sat in the back room of a small restaurant that didn't advertise itself. The front was ordinary tables, plates, laughter controlled to a polite volume. But the back room was where the neighborhood spoke in its real voice. A single lamp hung low over the table. Its light didn't spread far. It made a circle. Inside that circle, truth was allowed. Bumpy sat with his hat on the chair beside him, coat still on. He didn't eat yet. He rarely ate when a question was still alive. 3 men sat with him, one older, one younger, one quiet enough to disappear. If you looked away, they weren't there for company. They were there because Harlem ran on relationships, and relationships needed maintenance the way engines did. The older man cleared his throat first. Word traveled fast. Bumpy's eyes stayed on the table. Words are fast. The younger man leaned forward, restless. That big bastard called you Harlem trash in front of people. We supposed to let that sit? Bumpy lifted his gaze. Slow. His eyes met the younger man's like a hand on a shoulder. You ever see a rat run? Bumpy asked. The younger man blinked. What? Bumpy's voice stayed even. It runs fast, too. Doesn't mean it's important. The younger man pressed his lips together, holding his anger like a child holding a hot coin. The quiet man spoke without looking up. He wasn't acting alone. Bumpy nodded once. That was the point. A bodyguard that big didn't improvise. He was a wall built by someone else. Somebody wanted the scene. Somebody wanted witnesses. Somebody wanted Bumpy to swing first and look like the story they already wrote about him. Bumpy leaned back slightly, letting the chair creak once. The sound was small, but it filled the room because nobody else moved. Tell me what you know, Bumpy said. The older man began carefully, as if laying cards on a table. The big one, he ain't local. Came in with the show people. He's been seen with out-of-town gamblers, men with clean nails and dirty habits. Bumpy's face stayed calm. The quiet man added, He takes orders from a man who doesn't like Harlem having its own rules. The younger man's fist clenched. So we find the big one and Bumpy. Raised one finger. Not a threat. A pause. The younger man stopped like he'd been grabbed by the collar. Bumpy spoke softly. You find the hand with the leash. The lamp's light made shadows move on the wall. Outside the room, plates clattered. A woman laughed in the front dining area. He placed it on the table. What's that? The older man asked. Name, Bumpy said. He didn't slide it to them. He left it where it was, as if the table itself could read. The younger man leaned in and squinted. His eyes widened slightly. That's him? Bumpy nodded once. The older man's eyebrows lifted. You sure? Bumpy's gaze stayed steady. I don't move on maybes. The quiet man finally looked up. So what's the play? Bumpy didn't answer immediately. He reached for his glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it down with the kind of care that made men nervous. Because careless men slammed glasses. Careful men decided where things went. The play, Bumpy said, is to let him believe the hallway belonged to him. The younger man frowned. That makes you look. Bumpy's eyes cut to him. Not sharp with anger, sharp with truth. Look. Like what? Bumpy asked. The younger man swallowed. Look like you took it. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. His voice stayed low. Son, he said, a man can take a slap and still own the room. But if he swings back wrong, he can lose the whole building. It was respect. Bumpy sat back again. There's a difference, he continued, between revenge and correction. The older man nodded slowly, understanding. You want it clean. I want it certain. The younger man exhaled through his nose, trying to swallow his pride. So we wait? Bumpy shook his head once. We move. Quiet. He tapped the folded note with one finger. That Bodyguard. Bumpy said. He's the kind of man who's been told his weight is power. That makes him careless. Careless men love public rooms. They love crowds. They love being seen. The quiet man nodded. So we take him where he can't perform. Bumpy's gaze held his. Exactly. The older man shifted in his chair. What about the famous one? The man behind that door? Bumpy's eyes didn't brighten at the mention of fame. Fame was noise. Bumpy dealt with consequences. The famous one, Bumpy said, is a spectator tonight. Maybe he knows it, maybe he doesn't, but he's not the spine of this. He's the curtain. The younger man's jaw tightened. So who's the spine? Bumpy looked toward the wall as if he could see through it, through the restaurant, through Harlem, all the way to the men who believe this city was a board game. Men who want Harlem to bow, Bumpy said. Men who think a stage is a kingdom. He stood up. The three men rose with him automatically, like their bodies understood hierarchy even if their minds still fought it. Bumpy reached for his hat, placed it on his head, and adjusted it with one smooth touch. He didn't look in a mirror. He didn't need to. His face was his uniform. Outside, the street was colder now. Wind moved between buildings like a rumor. They walked a short distance, not in a pack, not drawing eyes. Harlem noticed everything, but Harlem also protected its own when it understood the shape of what was happening. A car waited at the curb. The driver stepped out, opened the back door. Bumpy got in Dot as they drove. The younger man sat in the seat across from him, still burning. Mr. Johnson, when that big man moved his hand. What if he had hit you? Bumpy's gaze stayed on the window, watching lights slide by. He didn't. Bumpy said. The younger man leaned forward, hungry for the answer behind the answer. But what if? Bumpy turned his head and looked at him. His eyes were calm enough to make the younger man feel childish. If he had, Bumpy said, we'd still be having this conversation. The difference is, it would already be finished. Younger man sat back, swallowing. The car slowed near a side street close to the theater district. The air here felt different, less community, more transaction. Faces moved faster. People avoided eye contact like it cost money. Bumpy stepped out, across the street. The theater's back entrance stood under a dim light. Two men smoked near. The door, collars up against the cold. Their laughter was careless. Bumpy didn't cross yet. He stood in the shadow of a building and watched. He watched the way the men stood, who faced the street, who faced the door. He watched who moved when footsteps approached. He watched who looked nervous. Then he saw the big man. The bodyguard stepped out, filling the doorway like a warning. He laughed with someone inside, then turned and looked down the alley. His shoulders rose and fell in a satisfied way, like a man who believed he'd already won. He patted his coat pocket, once checking what he carried. A habit, a tell. Bumpy's eyes stayed on him, steady. He wasn't looking at the bodyguard anymore. He was looking through him, because behind that wall of meat was the same old story. Men using hired weight to push people around, then calling it order. Bumpy didn't hate the bodyguard. Hate was loud, messy, personal. Bumpy hated what the bodyguard represented. A world where size replaced principle, where loud men thought they were kings. Bumpy stepped forward into the open. The men smoking stiffened. The bodyguard's smile faded as he recognized Bumpy, and for a moment you could see something flicker behind his eyes, surprised that Bumpy would come back into the same air. Bumpy walked toward him without hurry, not rushing, not hiding, not performing. The alley seemed to narrow. Again, the way it had Backstage. Only now there were no velvet curtains, no stagehands. No applause to cover screams, just cold brick, thin light, and the sound of a city that did not care who lived or died. The bodyguard squared his shoulders and stepped out, eager to show his importance. "Well, look at this," he said, voice heavy with amusement. Harlem trash came back. Bumpy stopped a few feet away. He looked at the man's face close enough now to see the small scars, the broken veins in the nose, the confidence. Built from too many easy victories, Bumpy's voice came out low. "You want to be seen," Bumpy said. The bodyguard frowned. "What?" Bumpy's eyes didn't blink. "You wanted witnesses," Bumpy continued. "You wanted a crowd to protect you." The bodyguard's lips curled. "I don't need a crowd." Bumpy nodded once, as if accepting the lie for what it was. Then he said, calm as a closing statement, "Good." And behind the bodyguard, the alley mouth quietly filled with men who did not speak. Not a mob, not a brawl. A closing door. Harlem heard about the hallway before sunrise. Not from newspapers. Newspapers printed what powerful men allowed. Harlem printed its truth through barbershop mirrors, diner counters, and church steps where old women watched the street like guardians. By morning, the story had grown legs. Some said the bodyguard had shoved Bumpy. Some said he'd raised a hand and stopped only because witnesses were present. Others claimed Bumpy had smiled and walked away like it meant nothing. Truth didn't matter as much as perception. And perception was dangerous when it touched a man whose name held weight, because in Harlem, respect wasn't vanity. Respect was infrastructure. It kept kids from joining the wrong crews. It kept outsiders from treating the neighborhood like open land. It kept predators cautious. And now that respect had been publicly tested, Bumpy Johnson understood something simple. If the insult stayed unanswered, Harlem didn't just lose face, Harlem lost protection. But he also understood something deeper, loud revenge, satisfied pride, while quiet correction preserved power. That morning, he sat at a small table near the window of a cafe that opened before most men woke. He drank coffee without sugar. Bitter-suited mornings like this. Across from him sat the older man from the night before. Outside, the street moved slowly. Delivery boys, Shopkeepers unlocking doors, steam rising from street grates like the city exhaling secrets. You see how fast it spread? The older man asked. Bumpy didn't look up. Disrespect travels faster than respect. The older man leaned closer. Young ones are restless. They think silence means weakness. Bumpy lifted his cup, took a slow sip, then placed it down carefully. Then they don't understand silence, he said. He turned his head slightly, watching two teenagers across the street. One was talking animatedly, throwing punches in the air as if reenacting the hallway confrontation. The other listened, eyes wide, absorbing the story like gospel. That was the danger. Myths formed faster than facts. If those boys believed Bumpy had been humiliated, they would start looking elsewhere for leadership. Not out of betrayal, but survival. Youth followed strength the way birds followed warmth. The older man followed Bumpy's gaze. You planning to make it public? He asked. Bumpy shook his head once. Public is where mistakes happen. The older man exhaled. He knew that tone. It meant the correction had already begun. What about the bodyguard? He pressed. Bumpy's eyes returned to his coffee. He's not the disease, Bumpy said. He's a symptom. The older man nodded slowly. So you're cutting deeper? Bumpy didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside, a black car rolled slowly past the cafe, then continued down the block. It wasn't Harlem-owned. You could tell by the way it moved, too cautious, too observant. Bumpy noticed everything. Men are watching. The older man murmured. Let them, Bumpy replied. He finished his coffee and stood. When Bumpy stood, conversations in nearby tables softened instinctively. Nobody shushed anyone. It just happened. Presence reshaped Space Dot as he stepped outside. The cold morning air hit clean. Harlem looked normal, but normal was often the mask worn. Before storms, he walked 3 blocks without escort. That was intentional. Protection followed power. But sometimes power walked alone to remind everyone it didn't hide. At a corner newsstand, the vendor greeted him warmly. Morning, Mr. Johnson. Bumpy nodded. Morning. The vendor hesitated, then leaned slightly forward. You hearing what folks saying? I hear enough, Bumpy replied. The vendor swallowed. They talking. Reckless. Bumpy looked at the papers stacked neatly, headlines about politics, war, money. None of them mattered as much as the whispers moving through Harlem. Let them talk, Bumpy said. Talking ends when truth arrives. He continued walking. By noon, he reached a social club tucked above a storefront. No sign, no advertisement. But men with influence came and went quietly. Inside, cigar smoke hung low, thick as fog. Card games paused when Bumpy entered, not out of fear, but acknowledgement. Chairs shifted subtly to make space. He moved to a back table where 3 men already waited, figures tied to Harlem's economic veins. Numbers, property, protection. One of them spoke first. Irritation clear. This situation is bad for business. Bumpy removed his gloves slowly. Explain. When outsiders think they can insult Harlem leadership publicly, the man continued, it invites pressure. It lowers negotiation leverage. Another added, we've already had calls. Men asking if your influence is reduced. Bumpy sat down. He didn't react to the insult inside that sentence. He reacted to the implication behind. It reduced. That word was poison. He folded his gloves neatly on the table before speaking. My influence, Bumpy said calmly, is not a rumor. It's a record. Silence followed. He looked at each man in turn. Has protection failed? He asked. They shook their heads. Has money stopped moving? No. Has Harlem been overrun? Again, no. Bumpy leaned back slightly. Then what you're worried about, he said, is appearance, not reality. The first man exhaled. Appearance shapes opportunity. Bumpy nodded once. And opportunity shapes patience. He leaned forward, voice lowering. You want loud retaliation, he said. Something visible. Violent. Immediate. None of them denied it. Bumpy's gaze hardened not with anger, but disappointment. That would satisfy your nerves, he said, and destroy our position. One man frowned. How? Because loud revenge proves their story, Bumpy replied. It paints me as temper, not authority. He paused, letting the logic settle. What we do instead, he continued, reminds them disrespect has consequences, even when nobody's watching. The men exchanged glances. One asked quietly, It's already in motion? Bumpy stood. It was in motion the moment he spoke. He put his gloves back on, one finger at a time, as he moved toward the exit. One of the men called after him. And the bodyguard? Bumpy stopped at the doorway but didn't turn. The bodyguard, he said, is learning the difference between size and weight. He left the club and stepped back into the street. Afternoon. Shadows stretched longer now. The city was shifting toward evening the hour, when mistakes were usually made, but Bumpy didn't make mistakes in the dark. He orchestrated outcomes. As he walked, a car pulled up beside him slowly. The window rolled down just enough. Inside sat the quiet man from the restaurant meeting. It's arranged, the man said softly. Bumpy didn't stop walking. Where? Same theater district. Private entrance. No crowd. Bumpy nodded once. And the leash? He asked. The quiet man's eyes flickered with understanding, close enough to feel it snap. Bumpy kept walking. Evening settled over Harlem like a curtain. Lights flickered on. Music returned to windows. But beneath it all ran a current of anticipation, because word had begun to shift. Again. Not louder. Heavier. People sensed something was coming. Not chaos. Correction. And in a narrow service corridor behind the theater, far from applause, far from witnesses, the bodyguard waited, unaware the story was about to move from public insult to private consequence. The service corridor behind the theater felt nothing like the stage. No velvet. No applause. No perfume trying to hide fear. Just narrow brick, sweating pipes, and a single overhead bulb that flickered like it didn't trust the men standing beneath it. The bodyguard stood near a steel door, rolling his shoulders slowly, warming muscle the way fighters did before stepping into a ring. His size filled the corridor the same way it had backstage. But here, there were no witnesses to impress. No crowd to lean on. Only silence. He checked his watch, impatient. He'd been told someone wanted to talk. He assumed it meant money, maybe a warning, maybe a negotiation. Men like him believed everything ended in deals or violence, and he was comfortable with both. Footsteps echoed from the far. Slow. Measured. Not sneaking, not rushing. The bodyguard looked up. Bumpy Johnson walked into the corridor alone. No escort. No visible weapon. Just that same dark suit, that same unbothered pace, that same face that never advertised emotion. The bodyguard smirked. Well now, he said, voice bouncing off the brick. You got guts coming alone. Bumpy stopped several feet away, leaving space between them, not out of caution, but intention. He wanted the man comfortable. He wanted him confident. I didn't come alone, Bumpy said calmly. The bodyguard glanced around, amused. Looks that way to me. Bumpy's eyes didn't move. That's because you only see bodies, he replied, not consequences. The bodyguard chuckled, deep and dismissive. You talk pretty, he said, but pretty talk don't change what happened backstage. Bumpy nodded once. You're right. That answer caught the bodyguard slightly off balance. He expected denial or anger. Not agreement. So you admit it? The bodyguard pressed. I stopped you. in front of everybody. Bumpy tilted his head a fraction. "You stood in a hallway," he said. "That's all." The bodyguard's smile hardened. "I called you trash too," he added, pushing. "Don't forget that part." "I remember," Bumpy said. Silence settled between them. Thick. Pressurized. The bodyguard stepped closer, boots heavy against concrete. "You know why I did it?" he asked. Bumpy didn't answer. "Because men like you get too comfortable." The bodyguard continued. "You think your neighborhood makes you important everywhere." He tapped his own chest. "Out here, size matters. Muscle matters. Fear matters." Bumpy's gaze lowered briefly to the man's hands, then rose again. "You believe that," he said. "I live that." The bodyguard replied. Bumpy nodded slowly. "Then this will be educational." The bodyguard frowned. "What?" And that's when he heard it. Not footsteps. Presence. A shift in air pressure the way animals sensed. Storms before rain arrived. He glanced behind him instinctively. Men stood at both ends of the corridor now. Not shouting. Not posing. Just present. 6 of them. Calm. Still. Dressed ordinary enough to disappear in crowds, but not here. Here, their silence made them larger than their bodies. The bodyguard's smirk faded. He looked back at Bumpy. "You said you came alone." "I said you only see bodies," Bumpy corrected. The bodyguard rolled his neck, annoyed but not intimidated yet. "So what? This a jump? You gonna hide behind numbers?" Bumpy shook his head once. "No," he said. "This is balance." He stepped forward slightly, not invading, just narrowing distance. "You made your point publicly," Bumpy continued. "You embarrassed a man in front of witnesses." The bodyguard snorted. "Yeah." "So now," Bumpy said calmly, "we correct it privately." The bodyguard's pride flared. He took another step forward, looming. "You think these boys scare me?" Bumpy didn't react. "They're not here to scare you," he said. "They're here to close exits." The corridor grew quieter. The bodyguard cracked his knuckles, sound echoing sharp. "Then let's stop talking." He moved fast for a man, his size hand shooting forward, aiming to grab Bumpy's collar, to drag him into the kind of violence he understood. But Bumpy didn't retreat. He pivoted small, precise, economical. The bodyguard's hand met air. Before the big man could reset, one of Bumpy's men stepped in, not wild, not emotional, driving a short strike into the bodyguard's ribs. Not enough to cripple, enough to interrupt. The bodyguard roared, swinging wide now, anger replacing control. Another man moved in from the side low, efficient, striking the knee. The big man staggered. Balance compromised for the first time. Bumpy still hadn't thrown a punch. He watched. Measured. Allowed the lesson to unfold. The bodyguard lashed out again, catching one man's shoulder, but the corridor was too tight, the angles too controlled. This wasn't a street fight. It was containment. 2 men seized his arms, not wrestling, just restricting. The bodyguard strained, muscles bulging, fury rising. "Cowards!" he barked. "Fight me straight." Bumpy stepped forward then, close enough now that the bodyguard had to look down slightly. And for the first time, the big man saw something in Bumpy's eyes he hadn't seen before. Not rage. Finality. Bumpy spoke. Low, voice steady enough to freeze motion. "You called me trash," he said, in public. The bodyguard glared, breathing heavy. Bumpy continued. "You believe size made you authority." He reached up, not striking, just adjusting the bodyguard's collar like a father correcting a child's uniform. "You embarrassed yourself," Bumpy said quietly. "Not me." Then, without warning, he drove a single, precise punch into the bodyguard's solar plexus. Not wild. Not theatrical. Perfect. Air exploded from the big man's lungs in a broken gasp. His strength collapsed inward, knees dipping, his breath abandoned. Bumpy stepped back immediately. No follow-up. No. Frenzy. Just one verdict delivered physically. The men holding the bodyguard released him slowly, letting him drop to one knee, not unconscious, not destroyed, but dismantled in front of controlled witnesses. Bumpy crouched slightly so their eyes met level. "This," Bumpy said softly, "is the difference between noise and power." The bodyguard struggled to breathe, pride cracking louder than his ribs. "You jumped me," he rasped. Bumpy shook his head once. "You were corrected," he replied. He stood, adjusting his cuffs. Then he added, voice calm as winter, "And the men behind you? They'll understand the message better than you do." He turned and walked toward the corridor exit. No celebration. No laughter. Just resolution. Behind him, the bodyguard remained on one knee, alive, conscious, but stripped of the illusion that size alone commanded respect, and somewhere above them, faint through the walls, the theater audience applauded a performance they believed was the night's main event. They had no idea the real lesson had just been delivered. Beneath their feet, Harlem didn't celebrate what happened. That was the difference between spectacle and authority. Spectacle needed witnesses. It needed noise, headlines, men retelling the story louder each time until truth got lost inside exaggeration. Authority moved quieter than that. Authority corrected, then returned to work. By morning, the theater district was already speaking in lower tones. The bodyguard had been seen leaving through a side exit, slower than he entered, shoulders tighter, pride heavier than his injuries. No police reports. No hospital. Drama. Just silence where arrogance had once stood, and that silence traveled faster than the original insult ever could. Inside Harlem, the shift was immediate but disciplined. Barbers still cut hair. Kids still ran errands. Women still leaned from windows, discussing prices and weather, but underneath the ordinary rhythm lived a restored balance, like a building that had briefly swayed in the wind but found its center. Again, Bumpy Johnson sat in the back room of the same quiet restaurant from nights before. Same table. Same low lamp, but this time there were no strategy papers, no folded notes, no tension sitting at the table like an uninvited guest, only calm. He poured himself tea instead of whiskey. Across from him sat the older man and the quiet one. The younger man stood near the wall, calmer now. Pride settled into respect. "You could have finished him," the younger man said after a while. Bumpy didn't look up from his cup. "I did," he replied. The younger man frowned slightly, confused. "He's still breathing," he said. Bumpy lifted his gaze then, not sharp, not mocking, just instructive. "Breathing isn't the measure," he said. "Understanding is." Silence followed as the lesson settled. The older man leaned forward. Word reached the men behind him. Bumpy nodded once. "And?" "They're quiet," the older man said. "No retaliation, no talk." Bumpy took a slow sip of tea. "Good," he said, because retaliation would have meant they misunderstood the correction. Silence meant they received it properly. The quiet man finally spoke, the famous one. "He asked about you." Bumpy's expression didn't change. "What did he ask?" he said. "He asked if the situation was resolved." Bumpy set his cup down carefully. "Tell him Harlem doesn't hold grudges," he said. "Only standards." The quiet man nodded. Outside the restaurant window, snow had begun to fall, lightly thin flakes drifting down like the city, exhaling tension. Bumpy watched it for a moment. Snow covered things without erasing them. It softened edges but preserved shape. Harlem was like that, scarred, layered, but dignified beneath whatever tried to bury it. The younger man spoke again, softer this time. "Why didn't you make it public?" he asked. "Would have sent a louder message." Bumpy leaned back slightly. "Because Loud messages attract louder problems, he said. He paused, then added, when you humiliate a man publicly, you create revenge. When you correct him privately, you create caution. The younger man nodded slowly, understanding the long game now. Bumpy reached into his coat and removed a small envelope. He slid it across the table to the older man. What's this? The man asked. Compensation, Bumpy said. For what? For the disruption, Bumpy replied. Businesses slowed while rumors moved. Stability costs money. The older man's eyebrows lifted. You're paying for something you didn't. Cause. Bumpy shook his head. Leadership absorbs shock, he said. That's the job. No one argued with that, because that was the real crown Bumpy wore, not fear, not violence, but responsibility. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. Younger man watched him with something close to admiration. So what happens now? He asked. Bumpy adjusted his coat once. Now? He said. Nothing. They looked confused. Bumpy clarified as he moved toward the door. The lessons delivered. Harlem stands. Life continues. He paused at the doorway, looking back once not at the men, but at the room, the lamp. The table where decisions shaped futures quietly. Then he spoke the final principle, calm as ever. Respect isn't taken by force, Bumpy said. He opened the door, cold air drifting in with snow. It's enforced by consistency. And with that, he stepped back into Harlem's winter streets. No applause, no announcement, just a man walking through the neighborhood. He didn't rule with noise, but with legacy.